What you need to know about low-frequency sound. This is Andrew Wright at the University of Idaho in Psychology 446, Engineering Psychology, Spring 2005, under Dr. Stefan Werner. In this 10-minute video, we'll be looking at the various things you need to know about low-frequency sound. What we think of as sound is really just a mechanical wave or vibration that's moving through a medium, generally air. And it has a frequency, a wavelength, an amplitude, and a pressure intensity. And as I said, we're primarily concerned about air and solid in this project. And this wave is it's a fluctuation in air pressure produced by a mechanical movement. The frequency is the number of vibrations per second, and it's measured in hertz. And humans in general can hear potentially as low as 20 hertz and as high as 20,000 hertz, although often people don't have the full range. And the most common frequencies we hear are around 1 to 3,000. A lot of the spoken word is in that range. That's the point at which we have the most acuity. Most animals actually have the same range as humans. Some can hear lower, like a whale, than we can, and some can hear higher. But that's about typical for most animals. So wavelength of sound. It's inversely proportional to frequency. And a human can hear waves of between 17 millimeters and 17 meters. And that's, in other words, that's the 20,000 to 20 cycles per second. The longer the wavelength of the sound, the further the sound travels through air, and the more easily it can go around barriers and penetrate through solid objects. It's actually quite helpful to visualize the different wavelengths of these different frequencies of waves as being equivalent to an animal of the same size. And so the larger the frequency, the smaller the animal. So an 8,000 hertz sound wave would be the same size wavelength as a butterfly, and a 25 hertz sound wave would have a wave the size of a Tyrannosaurus rex. And as we'll see moving through this presentation, that the size of the wavelength is really a quite important factor. Okay, so sound intensity is a measure of pressure, and could be air pressure in kilopascals, or it could be sound pressure in decibels. And this is also the amplitude of the wave. And it's a logarithmic scale, and the 20 decibels is a really quiet country scene. This is about as quiet a background noise as you would typically find. And coming back to the animal analogy, a high decibel rating would be an active, angry version of that animal, and a low decibel would be a tired, listless one. And so this is where the wavelength becomes a factor, because most people would probably take their chances, if they had to, with an angry butterfly rather than an angry T-Rex. And so this is just a point that the wavelength, when combined with intensity, really becomes a factor. A noise is simply an unwanted sound. So what is low-frequency sound? There is no standard definition. It's defined here as being under 200 hertz. The lower frequencies are harder to hear. This is quite important because the effect they have on the human body, resonance and also human buildings, is more important than their effect on the ear. And so a lot of these things are not well understood. They're also not well regulated. So we're talking here about long wavelength sound, the grizzly bear, crocodile, T-Rex, and so on. So there aren't that many common sources of low-frequency, long-wavelength sound that are natural. An earthquake or volcanic eruption or a large wave, or sometimes whales use it. So most of the sources of low-frequency sound that we would encounter will be from human-created machinery. And some examples would be a diesel engine, or a train, refrigerator, an air conditioning unit, or a wind farm. Very often it goes with a movement of a mechanism against air, and you can create that yourself if you drive with the rear window half down in your car. At a certain speed, let's say 50 miles an hour, probably there would be enough wind pressure against that opening to create a low frequency kind of whooshing, thumping sound. There are some problematic qualities to low frequency, long wavelength noise, the first of which is that they're not well understood, and because of that they're not well regulated or tested for. And when testing does take place, it's normal to use the A-weight scale, which intentionally underrepresents low frequency sound, and it's recommended that the C-weight test would be much better. And part of this is because noise problems are generally assumed to be to do with hearing and potential damage to the ear structures. But the issues with long wavelength sound are not necessarily related to hearing, they're related to other factors. Second problem is that they travel much further than short wavelength sounds. Therefore, normal judgments about safe distances from a noise source may be underestimated. There are two reasons. The first is that the longer wavelength sounds lose less energy as they pass through the atmosphere, quite a bit less. If we compare a 63 Hz sound to a 4000 Hz sound, it loses 1/260th of the energy, or 1/40th of the energy of a 100 Hz sound. So think of trying to slow down an elephant versus a guinea pig. So these longer wavelength sounds just keep on trucking. And secondly, they are reflected back down by an inversion layer, which is a couple hundred feet high in the atmosphere, whereas the shorter wavelength sounds just pass through that and dissipate upwards. A third problem is that long wavelength sound not only travels further, but it can go around and through walls and other structures. So unlike higher frequency sound and light, which have smaller wavelengths, long wavelength sounds are very difficult to stop with barriers or standard building structures like walls, windows, and roofs. And because the wavelengths are often the same size as a room or a building, it can more easily resonate with the whole structure. And it can really come right inside somebody's home without being stopped to a great extent. The only possibility would be quite involved sound remediation, which would also remove windows and all kinds of other features that people really want in their house. And the fourth thing is that low frequency sound can affect human physiology. NASA, for instance, determined that the eyes vibrate at 19 cycles a second, and that noise of that frequency can affect the vision, make the eyes start to vibrate, affect the peripheral vision. And they determined that different organs in the structures have similar bass resonant frequencies, that when the sound matches that, it can cause a problem. It's a little similar to the dynamic of an opera singer when they hit a note of exactly the same frequency that a wine glass will vibrate at. They can cause it to vibrate and shatter. So this can affect the vestibular system, very common to cause anxiety, can cause nausea, and it can result in people having trouble sleeping. Some of these physiological effects may even occur with low frequency sounds not sufficiently loud enough to be able to hear. Many industrial workers and other workers who work around heavy machinery can be affected by many different noise frequencies, including low frequency noise. There appear to be about 10 to 20% of the population who are quite affected by it, and even at decibel levels as low as 40 decibels. There are many cases on report of people who are even as far as 2 to 5 kilometers from wind farms who report negative consequences of these low frequency noises. In conclusion, low frequency, long wavelength sound is not well understood, is poorly regulated, and requires further study to understand both its effects and prevalence. In comparison to higher frequency noise, it is harder to hear, travels further without dissipation, and can more easily penetrate buildings. Long wavelength sound has effects on human physiology that appear to be potentially problematic, but are currently not well understood. My name is Andrew Wright, and thank you for viewing this presentation on what you need to know about low frequency sound.